had never really been the type to seek out adventure. I preferred the quiet of my small apartment in Lyon, where I could relax after a long day of work. But when I received the invitation to spend a weekend at a secluded cabin in the French countryside, I was intrigued. It seemed like the perfect getaway, an opportunity to unplug, breathe fresh air, and clear my mind. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, or so I was told. It belonged to a friend of a friend, a retired man who had recently passed away. His family had decided to rent it out for a weekend retreat, and they were offering it for a cheap price. The pictures online made it look charming. A small, rustic cabin with a wood-burning stove, a wraparound porch, and a beautiful view of the surrounding forest. I arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. It was an easy drive from Lyon, but as I ventured deeper into the countryside, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation creeping in. The winding roads became narrower, the trees denser, and the air heavier. By the time I reached the cabin, I could barely see any signs of civilization. The nearest village was miles away, and the only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The cabin itself was everything the pictures had promised. It had a rustic charm, with wooden beams on the ceiling, a stone fireplace, and large windows that looked out over the forest. There was no electricity, only a few oil lamps scattered around the room to provide light, and a small gas stove in the kitchen. It was the kind of place where you could feel the weight of time, where the walls seemed to carry the memories of years gone by. I unpacked my things and settled in, taking my time to explore the cabin. The place had an eerie calm to it, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt like it had been abandoned for some time, yet it had been well maintained, as if someone had been keeping an eye on it. The furniture was simple but functional, and there was a cozy feeling to the space that made me feel at home. As the evening wore on, I lit a fire in the wood stove and sat down with a book, trying to push away any lingering unease. I was here to relax, after all, and I couldn't let my mind wander into dark thoughts. But as the night deepened and the wind outside began to pick up, I started to feel the weight of the silence. It was so quiet that it almost felt unnatural. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The bed was comfortable and the blankets were warm. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an unsettling sense of being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, there were no other houses for miles around, and the only living creatures were the animals in the woods. I must have drifted off to sleep eventually, but I was jolted awake by a noise. At first, it was faint, just a soft thud, followed by a rustling sound. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear. There was another noise, this time louder, a scrape, like something was dragging across the ground. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I couldn't hear anything else for a moment, and I thought it might have just been an animal or the wind. But then I heard it again. It was unmistakable, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The logical part of me told me it was probably a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept quietly toward the window, my footsteps muffled by the old wooden floorboards. I peeked out through the small gap in the curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the forest was dark, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I couldn't see anything or anyone near the cabin, but the noise continued. It was coming from behind the cabin now, faint but distinct. I waited, listening intently, my mind racing through a dozen possible explanations. Maybe it was just a raccoon or a wild boar rummaging around. Or maybe it was a person, though why anyone would be out here so far from the nearest town, I had no idea. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence returned. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my nerves. I turned away from the window, telling myself it was nothing. But before I could make it back to bed, I heard the noise again. This time it was coming from the front door. I froze. The door, which I had locked earlier, was rattling. Softly at first, then more insistently. Someone or something was trying to get in. I felt a surge of panic and quickly grabbed my phone. But there was no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest tower, surrounded by nothing but dense forest. I was completely alone, with no way to reach anyone. The rattling of the door continued, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I could hear the slow creak of the door as it shifted on its hinges, but it didn't open. It was like someone was standing outside, pressing against it, waiting. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? Should I go outside and confront whoever or whatever was out there? Or should I stay inside and lock all the windows and doors, praying they would go away? The noise stopped again, and the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and decided to make a run for it. If there was someone out there, I wasn't going to stick around and wait to find out who they were. I moved quickly, slipping out the back door and into the dark woods. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my body. I could barely see anything, the only light coming from the faint glow of the cabin behind me. I moved through the trees, trying to keep my bearings, but every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I didn't know how long I had been walking. Maybe minutes, maybe hours, but the fear of whoever was behind me kept me moving forward. I wasn't sure what I was running from anymore. The sounds of footsteps had stopped, but I still felt the presence of someone following me, watching me from the shadows. And then I saw it, something that made my heart stop cold. Ahead of me, partially obscured by the trees, was another cabin. At first, I thought I had stumbled onto some sort of abandoned property, but as I got closer, I noticed the lights on inside. The windows were glowing faintly, and I could hear the faint hum of a radio. I approached cautiously, my feet crunching on the frozen ground. I knocked on the door, unsure what to expect. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing an older man, his face weathered and tired. His eyes flickered with surprise when he saw me. "I didn't expect anyone out here," he said. "What are you doing in the woods at this hour?" I hesitated for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I think someone's following me," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared." The man's expression softened, and he stepped aside to let me in. "You're not the first to get a little spooked out here. It's easy to imagine things when you're alone in the woods." He offered me a chair, and I sat down, still trying to calm my racing heart. The cabin was small, cozy, filled with the scent of wood smoke and coffee. The man introduced himself as Pierre, a local who had lived in the area his whole life. He had been staying in this cabin for a few days, enjoying the solitude. I spent the rest of the night in his cabin, sharing stories and drinking coffee until the sun came up. The fear that had gripped me earlier faded as the light of day broke through the trees. Pierre assured me that I had nothing to worry about. There were no dangerous people in the woods, just animals and the occasional wanderer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. By morning, I felt safe enough to return to my cabin. The woods no longer seemed as menacing in the light of day, and Pierre offered to walk me back to make sure I was all right. When we reached the cabin, everything seemed peaceful again. The door was locked, the windows were intact, and the strange noises from the night before were nothing but a distant memory. I spent the rest of the weekend at the cabin, and while I still felt a bit uneasy, I had to admit that the fear I'd felt in the night had been unfounded. I never did find out what caused the strange noises, but I never returned to the cabin after that weekend. Sometimes, I wonder if I was just imagining things, if the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But I still can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there in the woods, watching me. And that thought has stayed with me, even as the years have passed. I wasn't sure what had drawn me to this place. The cabin, abandoned for years, was perched on a secluded hilltop in the middle of nowhere. It was an old logging cabin, with rotting wood and cracked windows that had been covered by thick layers of dust and grime. I'd driven up for what I thought would be a quiet weekend to disconnect, but when I arrived and saw the place, I could feel something wasn't quite right. I had taken a few wrong turns on my way out here. The GPS had cut out after the last stretch of highway, and I ended up navigating by memory and the fading light. It wasn't until I arrived that I realized how truly isolated I was. The cabin was far more run down than I'd expected. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The only sign of life was the occasional bird flapping by, disappearing into the thick forest surrounding me. I could feel the weight of the silence the moment I stepped out of the car. There was no wind, no distant sounds of traffic or nearby homes, just the quiet rustling of leaves and my own breath in the chilly air. It was as though the place was frozen in time. I wasn't worried at first. It was just a cabin, after all. I had spent nights in isolated spots before. I liked the quiet. I preferred it, actually. And this, well, it wasn't like the usual places I camped in. No tourists, no chatter, just me in the woods. The wood was creaky beneath my feet as I crossed the porch and grabbed the doorknob. It didn't budge. I gave it a hard push, trying again. Nothing. The door was stuck, either from the weather or simply from neglect. After a few more attempts, I decided to step around to the back, hoping the rear door wasn't as stubborn. I knew that I'd eventually get inside, even if I had to force it. But as I rounded the corner, I froze. The back door wasn't just stuck. It was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. No one should have been here. The place was miles from the nearest neighbor, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Yet the door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. I stepped closer, cautiously, and peered inside. The cabin was dark, filled only with shadows and the odd ray of sunlight creeping through the cracks in the walls. Felt wrong. I wasn't sure why I felt uneasy at that moment, but something inside me told me to turn around. Yet I didn't. Curiosity kept me going. Slowly, I entered the cabin. My boots scraped against the dusty wooden floor as I took in my surroundings. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and stale wood. Old furniture sat forgotten in corners. Chairs turned over, a table covered in grime, and what looked like a collection of empty bottles on the counter. It was clear no one had been here for years, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I placed my pack down and wandered further in. The place was falling apart. Boards crooked, nails rusted, and windows that seemed to be slowly giving in to the elements. But it wasn't just the decay of the cabin that felt wrong. It was the heavy stillness. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I didn't want to stay. I should have packed up and left right then, but I told myself that I was just being paranoid. The daylight was fading, and I hadn't come all this way to turn back now. The bed in the back room looked reasonably intact, so I figured I'd sleep for a few hours and leave in the morning. I made myself some tea, not that I could really taste it, and tried to calm my mind. The night came quickly. It wasn't long before the cabin was plunged into darkness, the last flicker of light retreating behind the treeline. The isolation, which had felt comforting at first, now seemed suffocating. The air had grown colder, the kind of cold that you could feel in your bones. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind outside, but there was no breeze. The air inside felt still, thick, and heavy. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jerk awake. At first, It was just the creaking of the old timbers in the cabin, the wind brushing against the windows. But then I started to hear something else. A faint sound, almost like footsteps. They were soft, just on the edge of my hearing, but they were unmistakable. Someone or something was moving around outside. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was too clear, too regular. It stopped just as suddenly as it had started, and for a moment the cabin was silent again. I tried to focus on my breath, trying to ignore the noise, but the longer I stayed awake, the more I convinced myself that I wasn't alone. I listened harder, trying to pick out every detail. The footsteps, faint but deliberate, came again. They were closer this time. My heart started to race. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave. The car was parked too far away, and I didn't want to go outside into the cold, dark woods. But I couldn't just sit there and wait either. What if someone was out there? What if someone had been watching me? Then the sound came again. This time, it wasn't from outside the cabin. It was inside. A soft scraping sound, like a boot dragging across the floor. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly, and crept to the window. I pulled back the threadbare curtain, barely able to see through the dirt and grime. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, relieved but still uneasy. I backed away from the window and turned toward the door, my mind racing. Should I call the police? No signal. There was no way to reach anyone out here. It was just me. I was alone. I slowly made my way back toward the bed, but just as I was about to lie down, I heard it. A heavy thud. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This time it was loud. Too loud. Someone was definitely inside the cabin. My first instinct was to bolt for the door, but before I could even take a step, I heard a voice. Not human, but a muffled grunt. It was low, guttural, and it sent a chill through my spine. I didn't wait to see what it was. I rushed to the door and threw it open, running into the night. My legs burned as I sprinted down the narrow, overgrown path, the cold air biting at my face. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. When I reached my car, I slammed the door behind me and didn't stop until I was on the main road, the engine roaring as I sped away from the cabin. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The cabin remained behind me, its broken windows staring out into the dark woods. Whoever or whatever had been inside was still there. I didn't know what had been lurking in that abandoned cabin, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd never return. It was the fall of 2023 when I decided to go with my cousin Emily to the cabin she had inherited from our great uncle. It was tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, about a 3-hour drive from our small town in West Virginia. I hadn't seen her in a few years, and when she invited me to join her for a weekend getaway, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reconnect, and I needed the escape. My work had been exhausting, and a weekend in the mountains sounded like just the break I needed. The cabin wasn't exactly a luxury retreat. It was an old, rustic place, perched on a steep hill with a view of nothing but dense trees and rolling hills for miles. The kind of place that seemed untouched by time. From the outside, it looked like it could have belonged to any family of mountain folk who had been living there for generations. The wooden logs were weathered and cracked, the roof was covered in moss, and the small porch creaked whenever you stepped on it. Emily had told me it was in good condition when we first talked about it. But as we unloaded our bags, I noticed a few things right off the bat. The windows had thin, rusted bars on them, the kind you'd see on a place that was once more of a fortress than a home. And the air was thick with the smell of damp wood, almost like the cabin hadn't seen a fresh breeze in years. I didn't say anything about it, though. Emily seemed completely at ease, which put me a little more at ease, but I could still feel a slight unease in the back of my mind. I thought it was just the remoteness of the place getting to me. My cousin had spent a lot of time here when she was younger, and she knew the area well. She seemed confident. The first night, we unpacked and cooked a simple meal. There was a chill in the air, even though it wasn't cold enough to justify the fireplace yet, so we kept the windows shut. As we sat at the small dining table, the sound of the wind outside howling through the trees was constant. It was almost like the wind had a life of its own, rattling the walls and making the entire cabin creak in protest. Later that evening, Emily suggested we go out for a walk around the cabin. I wasn't too keen on it, but she insisted. "Come on, it'll be good for you. Get some fresh air," she said. Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and stepped outside into the dark. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the gravel path and the wind in the trees. We walked for a while, passing by the small creek that ran behind the cabin, the water gurgling quietly in the darkness. The woods surrounding the cabin were eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The trees towered over us, their limbs reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. It felt like we were completely alone in the world, and the longer we stayed out there, the more unsettling it became. I noticed something strange as we walked. A few of the trees near the creek had strange markings on them, deep gouges, almost like they'd been carved into the bark with something sharp. I pointed them out to Emily, who seemed to brush it off, saying it was probably just wildlife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was off. We continued walking in silence, and after a while, Emily stopped, her flashlight beam dancing on the ground as she adjusted the strap of her backpack. I was about to ask her if we could head back when I heard it. A distant rustling, like something moving in the underbrush. I froze. Emily didn't seem to notice, her back to me as she fiddled with her backpack. But I couldn't ignore it. The sound was getting closer, too close for comfort. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily?" I whispered urgently, but she was lost in whatever she was doing. And then it came into view. It wasn't an animal, at least not in the way I expected. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. His figure appeared through the trees, just standing there, watching us. He was tall, wearing a long coat that blended into the dark surroundings, and his face was shadowed by the brim of a worn-out hat. I stepped back instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. Emily, finally noticing my tension, turned to look. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us. His eyes were hard to make out, but the way he stood so still was unnerving. I didn't want to make a scene. "Let's go back to the cabin," I said quickly, already stepping in that direction. Emily didn't argue. We turned and started walking faster, not once looking back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the weight of the man's stare even as we hurried back to the cabin. When we got inside, I locked the door without a second thought. Emily looked at me, confused but not scared. "What was that about?" she asked. "I don't know, just felt wrong. Let's stay inside for a while." She didn't protest, but I could tell she was unsettled too. We didn't speak much after that, and soon we were both in our separate rooms, the silence of the cabin pressing in on me from all sides. That night, the wind seemed louder than usual. The trees screeched against the cabin walls like they were trying to get inside. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the silhouette of the man standing by the creek. I kept thinking about the strange markings on the trees, the gouges. Felt like something was watching us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't the real threat. The next morning, Emily suggested we go back to town to grab some supplies. I agreed, not wanting to stay another minute longer than I had to in the cabin. We packed up and left in her old Jeep, driving back down the winding mountain roads. I couldn't get the image of that man out of my mind. Who was he? What was he doing out there in the woods? When we returned, the cabin felt empty. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt different. like the air was thicker, heavier. Emily didn't seem to notice. She was excited to get some dinner started, but I just couldn't relax. That evening, we decided to go inside the woods once more. I didn't want to, but Emily was determined to make the most of the trip, so I reluctantly agreed. This time, we went deeper into the forest, past the creek, towards a small clearing where my uncle had told us about an old, abandoned structure that used to be a hunting lodge. As we got closer, I noticed something strange on the ground. Footprints, large and deep, but not from any animal I knew. They looked like a man's, but they were heavy, like someone was carrying something. I pointed them out to Emily, and she agreed they were strange but didn't seem as concerned as I was. We reached the clearing, but the lodge wasn't there. Just a crumbled stone foundation, overgrown with vines and moss. Nothing else. The place gave off a feeling of emptiness. It didn't feel right. We were about to turn around when I heard it. Footsteps again, but this time they were closer. I could hear the sound of boots crushing the underbrush behind us. We weren't alone. Before I could say anything, I felt a sudden chill, the kind that made your skin crawl. Emily looked up at me, her face pale. "Let's go," she said quietly. We started walking back the way we came, faster this time. The footsteps behind us followed. I didn't look back, but I knew they were there, just out of sight, matching our pace. We didn't stop until we were back at the cabin, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept hearing sounds, things scraping against the walls and windows, but when I checked, there was nothing. The morning came slowly, and when it finally did, we packed up and left, not saying a word. Emily didn't ask why. We both knew. The air felt lighter once we were on the road, and the drive back to town was quiet. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think Emily has either. The woods felt wrong, and whatever was out there, watching us, never let us forget it. I was 33 the year I decided to take a solo trip to northern Arizona. It was late September of 2019, and I had been working nonstop at a mid-sized warehouse in Tulsa, Oklahoma for over 8 years. It wasn't the kind of job you bragged about, but it paid the bills and kept my hands busy. I'd been dealing with some health issues that I now think were more mental than physical. Restlessness, exhaustion, short temper, bad sleep, stomach cramps that came and went without warning. I finally had enough saved to take a few weeks off, so I rented a small, off-grid cabin near the edge of the Navajo Nation. It was a place I'd found through a retired guy named Harold who ran a blog about isolated stays in the American Southwest. The pictures made it look peaceful. Dense brush, a distant view of a ridge, no roads in sight. The place sat about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. You had to drive another 6 miles down a narrow dirt track to reach it. The terrain wasn't forgiving. Loose rock, sudden dips, pinyon trees twisting out of the soil like stubborn old men. The first time I drove there, I had to stop twice to make sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn. But when I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was amazed. It was better than the pictures. The air was thin and cold but dry, and it smelled like juniper and sun-baked dust. The structure itself was one level, made of faded timber, probably cedar, with a tin roof and a simple front deck with 2 chairs and a crate used as a table. No running water, no power, a wood stove for heat. The outhouse was about 30 feet downhill from the back. There was a single trail, barely visible, that sloped toward a patch of trees about 100 yards away. I settled in fast. I brought my own food, canned beans, jerky, rice, instant coffee, oats, and a water container I refilled at a ranger station 45 minutes away. My days were slow. I read from an old paperback I brought. I wrote in a notebook. I hiked short loops in the brush. I split wood. The quiet was intense. The only sounds came from birds, wind, and the occasional scurry of something small in the undergrowth. At night, the dark was total. No lights on the horizon, no hum of nearby roads, just black pressing down against the windows and roof. By the fourth night, I started noticing sounds I couldn't explain. It began just before I fell asleep. I had a cot near the center of the cabin, next to the stove. I always stoked it with logs around 8 p.m. so the cabin would stay warm through the night. I'd use a headlamp to read, then turn it off and listen to the wind until I drifted off. That night, after I'd turned everything off, I heard footsteps, light ones moving on the dirt outside. I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, or something smaller. But then I heard what sounded like a scrape on the front deck. Not fast, slow and deliberate like someone dragging something across it. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened harder. It was dead quiet again. Not even wind. I thought about getting up to check, but figured it was my imagination. That kind of silence can mess with your head. The next morning, I looked around the front. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no drag marks, not even disturbed dust. I chalked it up to a dream and tried to forget it. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, I knew I was awake. I'd just finished relieving myself at the outhouse and was walking back when I caught something at the corner of my vision. It was to my right, maybe 30 or 40 feet off the trail near a patch of squat junipers. Something moved, a shape. I turned quickly and shined my flashlight, but there was nothing, just twisted trunks and shadows. I hurried back, locked the cabin door, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone truly determined, and sat by the stove for a while. That night I didn't sleep. I heard the steps again. Soft, close. This time they circled the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. I didn't leave the next day. I don't know why. Maybe part of me wanted to believe it was still just animals. Maybe I didn't want to feel like a coward. So I stayed. But I started noticing more. Subtle things. A stone was placed on the front steps that I didn't remember being there. Just a small, round one, like a river rock. Another time, the door to the outhouse was open in the morning. I always shut it. I'm obsessive about that sort of thing. On the sixth day, I found a long strand of dark hair caught in the doorframe of the cabin. It was coarse, not animal fur, definitely hair. I started sleeping with my knife close. There was no cell signal out there. My car was parked about 30 yards away, just off the brush, hidden by a fold in the land. I kept the keys in the cabin, and every night I made sure they were in the same spot on the crate I used as a nightstand. Every morning I checked them. Nothing changed, but I knew I was being watched. The worst night came after I tried hiking further east along the ridge. I went further than I had before, about 2 miles out. It was just afternoon when I turned around, but something felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I heard what sounded like movement above me on the ridge, but every time I stopped to listen, it went silent.
No birds, no insects.
No wind, just nothing. That night I barely slept. Around 1 a.m., I heard something behind the cabin. Then something hit the back wall. A single thud, then silence. I got up and grabbed my flashlight, stood near the door for almost an hour, afraid to go outside. Eventually, I cracked it open and swept the light in a wide arc. On the edge of the beam, just beyond the outhouse, I saw a shape. First, I thought it was a deer, but it wasn't moving right. It was crouched, like a person squatting low. His head was tilted sideways. It didn't flinch from the light. I held the beam steady, but it just stayed there.
No blinking.
No movement. Then, just as I took a step back inside, it straightened up. Not all the way. It turned slightly, still hunched, and moved off behind the trees. The way it moved wasn't right. Not fast, not slow, but off. Like something trying to move like a man but not quite pulling it off. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and didn't sleep at all. I packed before the sun rose, tossed everything into my bag, checked and rechecked the keys, and waited for enough light to drive out. I didn't see it again. Not on the drive. Not during the last check of the cabin. But when I looked back, as I turned onto the main dirt road, I swear I saw something standing just at the edge of the trees. Barely a figure. Just tall enough, dark enough to catch the light of the early sun. I never told anyone the full story. Not my friends, not my boss, not my sister. Just said I needed time alone and the trip had been good. But I don't sleep well anymore. I keep a bat by my bed. I check my locks twice. I don't know what I saw. I know what people call it out there. Skinwalker. But I don't believe in that. Not really. I think someone was out there, living in the woods, watching people, maybe even copying them. And I think they've been doing it a long time. That hair I found in the doorframe, I kept it in a plastic bag. Sent it to a buddy who works at a university lab as a favor. Said it wasn't from any known domestic animal. Said it was likely human but degraded, with unusual mitochondrial markers that didn't match any known local population. I never followed up. Didn't want to know more. I won't go back to Arizona. Not anywhere near the nation. That part of the world is big and empty and quiet, and it's easy to think you're alone when you're not. The cabin's probably still there, but someone else can stay there now. It was 2016, and I was 32. I'd just taken a week off from work at a machine shop in the city to spend some time alone in a small cabin I'd rented deep in the mountains of western North Carolina. I'd found the place on an old listing site that wasn't even around anymore. Just a basic post with a few blurry pictures. But the price was cheap, and the write-up said it had power, running water, and a wood stove. That was enough for me. I'd been feeling burned out from work, from people, from noise. I needed to step back for a while. I'd gone on hiking trips and done some camping before, but this time I wanted something more isolated.
No campgrounds.
No designated fire rings or marked trails. I wanted to just be out there, away from all of it. The drive to the cabin took almost 4 hours. Once I got off the main road, it was another 40 minutes of winding gravel path through thick woods, the kind that started to all look the same after a while. Every now and then I had to slow down for puddles or to get around branches. My old Toyota Tacoma could handle it, but I could feel the road tugging at the tires like it didn't want me up there. When I finally got to the cabin, it was smaller than I thought. Just a one-room wooden box with a slanted metal roof and a small porch. The trees crowded right up to it, and it looked like no one had been there in a while. The gravel turned to mud around the base of it, and the steps up to the door were slick. I stood there for a minute before unloading the truck. It was dead quiet. The air smelled heavy, like wet dirt and pine needles. I could hear the soft clicking of insects and the slow creaking of trees moving in the wind. Inside, it was simple. One cot-style bed pushed up against the far wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a small stove in the corner. There was a rusted propane lantern hanging from a hook, but I had brought my own lights. There was also a narrow door in the back that led to a tiny bathroom. Just a toilet and a cracked mirror over a dry sink.
No shower.
The place smelled like old wood and mildew, but not in a bad way. It reminded me of old hunting cabins I used to visit with my uncle in Maine when I was a kid. I spent the rest of the afternoon unloading gear and walking the perimeter of the cabin. I made sure the doors and windows locked, checked the firewood stack, and looked for any signs of animals nesting under the porch. Everything seemed all right. There was a dense line of trees about 20 feet behind the cabin that stretched endlessly in both directions. That wall of green felt heavy, the kind of place where you could step in and be swallowed. Started to rain that night, a slow, steady patter that built up over a few hours. By midnight, it was pouring. I lay in bed listening to the rain hammer the metal roof. It was loud but rhythmic, almost calming. I didn't mind. In fact, I liked it. That kind of rain made me feel tucked away from the world, protected. The next day was more of the same. Then, clouds so low they scraped the tops of the trees. I stayed in and read a paperback I'd brought, fixed myself a basic breakfast, and went over the map again. There were no nearby cabins or homes marked for miles, just the old logging roads and rivers cutting through the landscape like faded scars. I liked knowing no one was close. Later that afternoon, while the rain slowed to a drizzle, I put on a poncho and stepped out to stretch my legs. I didn't go far, just around the cabin and maybe 50 yards out into the woods. The trees were dripping. I remember standing there listening to the distant creak of wet wood and the tapping of rain on leaves when I saw the first thing that didn't sit right. There were boot prints in the mud. Not mine. I knew mine. These were larger, deeper, fresh. They came from the trees and stopped near the side of the cabin. I followed them with my eyes. They didn't go all the way to the door. They stopped short just under the window, then turned back the way they came. I stood still for a long time staring at them. Could have been from a hiker or a hunter, I told myself. Someone just curious. But out here, in this weather, there were no signs of any vehicle. No tire tracks or disturbed brush along the path in. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I kept my headlamp close and my boots on. I didn't sleep well. The rain returned harder than before, pounding against the walls and roof like it wanted to get in. Every now and then I thought I heard something under the wind. Footsteps, maybe, or branches snapping, but I told myself it was probably just animals or the trees shifting. By the third day, I was anxious. I went out first thing in the morning to check the tracks again. They were still there, now smudged and fading. But there were new ones too. This time they went all the way to the back of the cabin, right up to the small bathroom window. I had kept that window shut. I checked it. Now it was cracked open. Just a little, an inch at most. But it was open. I stood there in the rain, staring at it. The mud around the base of the wall had prints again, wide, deep ones like from someone heavy.
No barefoot, no claw marks.
Just boots. I closed the window and locked it tight. After that, I brought my camping knife into bed with me. I kept it under the pillow. The air inside the cabin felt different, less calm, like something was watching. That night I heard a knock, just once. It was soft, maybe even just the wind, but it was near the back of the cabin, near the bathroom window. I turned off my lamp and held my breath. My heart was slamming in my chest. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, listening. No other sounds came, just the rain, the wind, and that humming silence in between. In the morning, I went out again. This time I found something worse. There was a rope tied around one of the trees near the path. It was fresh, clean, white synthetic cord. It had been looped and tied like someone was preparing a snare or a noose. The knot was tight, professional looking. I untied it with shaking hands and took it inside. Now I wasn't just uneasy. I was afraid. I packed my things, threw them in the truck. I didn't even bother organizing, just jammed them in. My plan was to drive down the mountain and get back to town. Leave early, screw the rest of the trip. But when I started the truck, the engine made a weird grinding sound. Then it died. I tried again. Nothing. Third time, same thing. It wouldn't turn over. I opened the hood, checked the battery. Everything looked okay. The cables were tight. But then I saw it. The fuel line had been cut. Clean, sharp, a straight slice through the rubber. Gasoline had leaked out and mixed with the mud under the truck. I smelled it immediately. Someone had done it on purpose. I slammed the hood shut and stood there in the rain, breathing hard. There was no cell signal. I'd known that coming in. That was part of the appeal.
No emails.
No calls. But now it meant I was stranded. I spent the next few hours trying to calm myself, trying to think straight. I could hike out, but the nearest town was over 12 miles by foot, through thick woods, in the rain, with someone out there, someone watching me. I decided to wait until morning. I had some food left, a dry change of clothes. I could manage one more night, then I'd hike out first thing. If I left early, I could be back in town by mid-afternoon. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the lantern on, my knife in my hand, the door locked and barred with a chair. Every few minutes I'd get up and check the windows, look for shadows, listen. Around midnight, I heard rustling outside, then footsteps, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin. I didn't move. Whoever it was didn't knock this time. They didn't try the door. They just walked around. Once, twice, then silence. I stayed up until morning, eyes bloodshot, waiting for daylight. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed what I could in a dry bag and headed out. I took a small hatchet and my knife. No gun. I didn't own one. The forest was soaked. My boots sank into the mud with each step. The rain had lightened to a mist, but everything was slick. I followed the gravel path downhill. Every now and then I looked over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following. About 2 miles in, I saw movement up ahead. Someone stepped out from the trees. A man. He was tall, wearing a green poncho. I stopped cold. He didn't say anything, didn't raise a hand or wave, just stood there. I turned and ran back the way I came. I left the path and cut into the trees. My legs burned, slipping in mud, branches slashing at my arms and face. I kept going until I couldn't breathe. I finally crouched behind a fallen log and waited. I stayed there for hours, watching, listening. I never saw him again. By late afternoon, I found an old ATV trail and followed it downhill. Eventually, I came out near a fire service road and flagged down a passing forestry truck. The guy driving it didn't ask many questions, just gave me a weird look and let me ride in the back until we got to town. I didn't even go back for the truck. I called a tow company the next day and told them where it was. I never found out who that man was. No reports, no missing persons, no signs of illegal camps or poachers. The only thing the sheriff's office said was that I shouldn't have been up there alone. I haven't gone back since. I don't hike anymore, don't camp, not even in parks. Something about that trip changed the way I see the woods. They're not peaceful to me now, not quiet. They're too big, too empty, and sometimes not as empty as they seem. The weather was already beginning to shift as I arrived at the cabin. It wasn't a planned getaway, but after a hectic few months, I needed time to myself. My name is Liam, and at 28, I'd never really been a fan of the woods, but something about the solitude appealed to me now, a chance to clear my mind. The cabin I'd rented was tucked away in a remote part of England, deep in the forest of the Lake District. The sort of place you'd only find if you knew where to look. It was an old stone building, small but charming, with ivy crawling up its walls. The roof was thatched, and the windows looked out onto nothing but trees. The air smelled thick with damp earth and pine. The peaceful quiet was unnerving, in a way, but I pushed that feeling aside as I unloaded my car. I was here for a week. I had everything I needed: books, a guitar, some snacks, and a few bottles of whiskey.
No distractions.
The cabin was everything I had imagined, simple and rustic. It even had a little wood-burning stove, which would come in handy as the nights were expected to drop below freezing. The first night was uneventful. I lit the fire, made some soup, and settled into the cozy armchair by the hearth. I cracked open a book, but after a while, I couldn't focus. There was something strange about the place. Maybe it was the stillness of the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sense of danger, more like a quiet pressure, as if something was watching. But when I looked outside, all I saw were trees. I brushed it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe I was too used to the noise of the city. I drank another glass of whiskey, hoping it would settle my nerves. Didn't. Still, I eventually fell asleep, the soft crackle of the fire lulling me into a restless slumber. The next morning was foggy, thick gray clouds clinging to the mountain peaks. I decided to go for a walk, stretch my legs. The air was crisp and biting, and the ground was soft with the previous night's rain. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees. They weren't just random scratches or animal carvings. These were deliberate, patterns that seemed too intentional to be natural. I stopped and stared at one of the trees, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a symbol, an X with lines through it. I didn't recognize it. I felt an uneasy shiver crawl down my spine. This wasn't the kind of place where people left signs. The woods were empty, save for a few hikers that passed through, but none of them seemed the type to mark trees. I quickly turned around and headed back to the cabin. By the time I returned, the cabin was even colder than before. I threw more wood onto the fire, hoping the warmth would chase away the strange feeling that had begun to settle in my chest. The day passed without incident. I kept myself busy, chopping wood, reading, cooking, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had been following me since I arrived. But when night came, I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every sound, the wind rustling the trees, the occasional snap of a twig outside, made me jump. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. I froze. Who would be out here? I wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. I didn't move. The wind howled outside, and the fire crackled. I glanced at the door, my mind racing. Maybe it was a hiker who had lost their way? But no, that didn't make sense. Whoever it was, they would have knocked during the day. Another knock. I got up, cautiously, and moved toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I peered through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door slightly, sticking my head out, and looked around. Nothing. I stepped outside. The air was heavy with fog now, and the world felt closed in, like the trees were pressing in on the cabin. I walked to the edge of the porch, scanning the darkness, but saw no signs of life. No footsteps, no lights, no movement. I shut the door and bolted it. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. The hours passed in silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I couldn't get comfortable. Every noise, every creak of the old house felt amplified. I tried to ignore it, but sleep wouldn't come. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of something tapping at my window. I shot up, heart racing. The moonlight was barely enough to illuminate the outside, but I could see the outline of someone, standing just outside the glass. The figure was tall, obscured by the fog, but I could make out the shape of a person. I stood frozen, unable to move, my body locked in fear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure moved away from the window. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to rush outside, confront whoever it was. But another part of me, the smarter part, knew better. It was a terrible idea. What if there was more than one? I glanced around the room, looking for anything to defend myself with. A heavy poker by the hearth, a flashlight, anything. But then there was a noise. It came from outside, just beyond the cabin, faint but unmistakable. A crackling of twigs. The sound of something moving in the underbrush. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited. hoping it would stop, hoping whatever it was would go away. But the noises kept coming, getting closer, until I could hear breathing, shallow and rapid. Something was right outside the cabin. I crept to the window, peeking out through the curtains. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. Two figures, standing just beyond the trees. They were humanoid in shape, but didn't move like any person I'd ever seen. They stood completely still, as if waiting for something. I tried to shake the image out of my mind, but I couldn't. Their stillness, their odd posture. It was like they weren't human at all. They felt wrong. I backed away from the window, panic rising. I needed to get out, to leave, but the thought of stepping outside was terrifying. I grabbed my things. Quickly, I packed up whatever I could carry. My wallet, my phone, my jacket. The rest I left behind. I was going to leave, head back to civilization, and never look back. I wasn't even sure what I was running from, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I moved quickly toward the door, but then I heard the sound again. The same scraping, the same breath, but this time it was closer. Too close. I opened the door just a crack and glanced outside. The figures were gone. There was no sound, no movement. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them up. I stepped out cautiously, my footsteps quiet against the wet ground. I didn't know what I was looking for, just a sign that I wasn't losing my mind. I glanced around, but the fog had thickened again, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. Then, through the haze, I saw something, movement. It was fast, too fast, and before I could even register what was happening, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, ready to defend myself, but there was nothing there. I wasn't sure what to make of the entire experience. I didn't know if I was just exhausted, if I had imagined the figures in the woods, or if something real had happened out there. But the one thing I knew was that I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed the rest of my things and left the cabin behind. As I drove away, the fog slowly lifted, and I could see the familiar winding roads leading me back to the town. I didn't look back. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that cabin, but I know one thing for sure. Some places just aren't meant to be explored. I had been planning this trip for months, eagerly anticipating the solitude and peace of a secluded cabin in the mountains. I was 32, recently divorced, and in need of a break from everything: work, people, and especially the noise that came with city life. The cabin I rented was small, nestled in a dense part of the forest in the Adirondacks, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. I'd rented it through a remote cabin booking site that promised privacy and escape from the modern world. Perfect. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that disappeared into thick forests of pine and maple trees. The air felt different here, crisp and cool, as if I was stepping into another world. I wasn't exactly a seasoned outdoorsman, but I'd spent some time camping in my younger years, and I figured I could handle a weekend by myself. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. The place looked just like the pictures: rustic, weathered wood, a small porch, and a stone chimney. The cabin was tucked away from any other structures, and the nearest neighbor, according to the owner's instructions, was miles away. I unlocked the front door with the key I'd found in the hidden spot near the porch. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a fireplace, an old wooden dining table, and a leather couch that looked well-worn but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a lofted bedroom with a double bed. The cabin felt like it had been frozen in time, as if no one had bothered it for decades. I liked that, felt real and untouched. I set my bags down and took a moment to breathe in the stillness. There was no noise here except for the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves in the wind. I went outside to gather some wood for the fireplace, as the evening was cooling off rapidly. As I stepped out onto the porch, I looked around. The cabin was surrounded by tall trees, their dark silhouettes against the twilight sky. The isolation felt both calming and a little unsettling, but I tried not to let it bother me. I'd chosen this solitude for a reason. I got the fire started easily enough and spent the next few hours sitting by the hearth, sipping on a beer and staring into the flames. It was peaceful, but there was something about the cabin that felt off. Maybe it was the silence or the way the wind howled through the trees outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The feeling didn't go away the next morning. I woke up early, as I usually did when I was alone, and the cabin felt quieter than ever. The only sound was the occasional creak of wood settling in the cool morning air. I spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease, but it stayed with me, like a shadow following my every step. That night, as I sat on the porch with my dinner, I heard something. It was faint at first, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. At first, I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the woods. But then it came again, louder this time, like someone was walking in the woods just beyond my cabin. My heart began to race as the footsteps got closer. I stood up, straining to see into the dark, but the trees were too thick, and the only light came from the small lantern by the door. My rational mind told me it was probably just an animal, maybe a person out for a walk, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel my pulse quicken. The sound stopped abruptly. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen, but the night went silent again. I slowly sat back down, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. The woods were full of noises, after all. I finished my dinner in the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin and drive to the nearest town. I needed to clear my head. As I drove along the winding road, I passed no other vehicles, and the town felt like a ghost town when I arrived. It was small, with just a few shops and a gas station. I picked up some supplies and made a quick stop at the local diner for lunch. The waitress was friendly enough, but her eyes lingered on me longer than was comfortable. She didn't say much except that the woods could be a little strange. That night, after I returned to the cabin, the feeling of being watched came back stronger than ever. This time, I didn't want to sit outside. Instead, I stayed inside, with the curtains drawn, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. I knew the next day I would be leaving, but something kept me from packing up and leaving right then. A small part of me wanted to see how the night would play out. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping. It was close, too close. My stomach turned as I grabbed the flashlight by the couch and crept toward the front door. I peeked out through a crack in the curtain, but there was nothing to see. The light from the cabin barely cut through the darkness of the forest. I waited, breath held, for any sign of movement, and then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dark, moved past the edge of the porch. It was tall, thin, and dressed in what looked like a dark jacket. It didn't stop, just moved across my view and into the trees, disappearing into the blackness. My heart raced. There was no reason anyone should be out there. The closest road was miles away. Who would be out in the woods at this time of night? I couldn't let my curiosity get the better of me, but I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my boots, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and the crunch of the snow beneath my boots felt too loud in the silence. The figure was gone, but I could still see the broken branch on the ground where it had passed. I followed it, my breath coming out in short gasps, until I reached a small clearing. There was nothing there but the trees and the wind. No sign of anyone. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. My pulse thudded in my ears as the beam of light swept across the trees. It landed on something. A figure standing just a few yards away, its face hidden in the shadows. I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't move either. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished back into the darkness. I ran back to the cabin without a second thought. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. I didn't know who or what I had seen, but I had no intention of finding out. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, not daring to sleep. The sounds outside stopped, and the morning came with no sign of anyone. The next day, I packed up my things and left. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the entire time. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else, but I was glad to be leaving that place behind. To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there in the woods that night. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe there was someone or something in those woods who didn't want me there. Either way, I never went back.